The letter lies open beneath a single brass lamp, its seal already broken, its final sentence underlined twice. Across the table, William does not look at Camilla, and Camilla does not look at the man holding the file. The question has been asked in a room where questions are usually answered before they are spoken. Will her grandchildren be admitted to the next royal gathering, or will their names disappear from the guest list without explanation? William reads the last line again. Then he closes the folder and says, "No, before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update." For years, the public image of the modern monarchy has depended on a delicate illusion that every family disagreement can be wrapped in ceremony, every private hurt softened by protocol, and every competing household placed beneath one crown. But institutions do not survive on appearances alone. They survive on documents, precedent, and the people willing to enforce both when enforcement becomes personally expensive. At the center of this story stands William, Prince of Wales, the heir apparent, meaning the person first in line to inherit the throne when the reigning monarch dies or abdicates. His position is not merely a family title. It is a constitutional expectation, a public trust, and an obligation to protect the continuity of an institution larger than any individual household. Across from him sits Camilla, Queen Consort, a title used for the wife of a reigning king who shares the public dignity of the crown but does not inherit the throne in her own right. Camilla's grandchildren are not children of the sovereign, and they do not occupy the formal succession. Yet for years they have appeared at family occasions, private celebrations, and selected public gatherings, becoming part of the larger image of a blended royal family. That image matters because Charles, King of the United Kingdom, the reigning monarch, whose formal acts carry constitutional and ceremonial weight, has spent much of his public life trying to make an old institution appear capable of absorbing a complicated modern family. His marriage to Camilla was once treated as a fracture line. Over time, it became a story of endurance, compromise, and gradual acceptance. The disputed object is the royal guest list, a controlled document, meaning a document whose access, wording, and distribution are formally managed by an institution. It is not simply a list of names. For a state dinner, a national service, or a family event held on royal property, it can determine who stands beside the sovereign, who appears in official photographs, and who is quietly excluded from the visual language of belonging. Behind the disputed event stood three people carrying three very different wounds. William carried the wound of succession, the pressure of knowing that every gesture made by the current reign becomes a precedent he may one day inherit. Camilla carried the wound of having entered the family through years of public suspicion, aware that her grandchildren could be treated as evidence of a private life the institutions still considered inconvenient. Charles carried the oldest wound of all, the fear that any visible division inside his household would be interpreted as a failure of the crown itself. The immediate request appeared harmless. According to a documented internal account, Camilla's office asked whether her grandchildren could attend a forthcoming royal event connected to the king's charitable work. The request was presented as a family accommodation. No new title was sought, no line of succession was altered, no public statement was requested. But the language of the request contained a phrase that unsettled the household office: standing family inclusion. That phrase did not describe one invitation. It appeared to ask for a continuing understanding that Camilla's grandchildren would be treated as part of the regular royal circle at future events, even when those events were officially linked to the crown rather than privately hosted by the family. The difference was small on paper and enormous in practice. A private family invitation could be granted by the host. A standing inclusion would create an expectation. An expectation, repeated often enough, could become precedent. And precedent, inside a monarchy, can become a rule without anyone ever admitting that a rule has been made. The first response was not a refusal. It was a request for clarification. Then the room went quiet. Charles had not objected publicly. He had not summoned advisors or issued a warning. He had simply stopped answering the question directly. According to a private source who later described the exchange, the king had been shown the request overnight and asked whether he wished to approve it personally. He had looked at the page for several seconds. Then he had said nothing. That silence became the first mystery. It also became the first weapon. Camilla's supporters believed the king's quiet meant consent without confrontation. William's supporters believed it meant the opposite, a monarch unwilling to choose, leaving the heir to absorb the conflict. Inside the household, people began using a phrase that would later appear in an archived record, the overnight pause. It meant that Charles had seen the issue, understood its implications, and chosen not to settle it before morning. Morning arrived with no statement, no call, and no revised list. At first, the matter looked like a scheduling problem. Then a second document appeared. According to a logged memorandum circulated among senior household staff, the requested language had been copied from an older planning paper connected to the king's private office. That paper discussed family visibility during the early years of the reign, when advisors had been searching for ways to present a unified household without expanding formal status or altering constitutional arrangements. Family visibility, meaning the controlled appearance of relatives at public events without granting them official office, was never intended to function as a permanent entitlement. It had been a communication strategy, not a constitutional principle. But a sentence in the older paper had been separated from its surrounding paragraphs and repeated in the new request. The copied clause said that the immediate family of the consort may be accommodated where the presence supports the dignity and continuity of the sovereign's household. On its face, the sentence seemed generous. The problem was the word immediate. The original paper used the term narrowly, referring to children and dependents living within the sovereign's active household. The new request used it broadly, treating grandchildren as part of the same protected circle. The difference was not emotional, it was structural. A consultant who had quietly advised one of the family offices noticed the change first. A consultant in this context is an outside specialist who offers strategic advice without holding a formal royal appointment. According to an internal briefing later summarized for senior staff, the consultant warned that the copied clause could be used to argue for routine access at events not controlled by Camilla's own office. That was the hidden strategy. The request was not only about children attending a family occasion, it was about moving a private relationship into an institutional category. It was about turning affection into access, access into visibility, and visibility into a future claim that exclusion would be interpreted as punishment. The household secretary, the senior official responsible for coordinating the monarch's administrative and ceremonial affairs, asked for the original paper. It could not be found in the active office. For 3 days, the staff searched through briefing folders, transition files, and archived correspondence. Then a junior records officer located a scanned copy in a dormant account used during the transition from one reign to another. Dormant account, meaning a digital archive no longer used for current business but retained for legal, historical, or administrative reference. Sounds harmless. In this case, it contained the sentence that could either support Camilla's argument or destroy it. The scan was incomplete. One page was missing. The missing page contained the definitions. Without it, immediate family seemed flexible. With it, the phrase might be limited to people who held a formally recognized household relationship with the sovereign. The entire argument depended on what no one could see. Internal briefings later suggested that someone had known exactly which page was absent. No accusation was made. No culprit was named. But the discovery changed the atmosphere. A family disagreement had become a question about records management, institutional memory, and whether a document had been selectively used to produce an outcome its author never intended. The conflict was no longer personal, it was structural, and William understood that if he allowed the new interpretation to stand, the issue would not end with Camilla's grandchildren. It would create a method by which any relative, through any future consort, could claim regular access to the public machinery of the crown. The argument inside the palace was not whether the children were loved, it was whether love could be used to rewrite a boundary without acknowledging that the boundary had changed. The next event was already approaching. Invitations were being prepared. Seating plans were being checked. The press office was drafting language about family unity. Camilla's office asked for a decision. The answer did not come. Instead, the king went quietly overnight. That phrase did not mean Charles disappeared. It meant he moved through the palace after midnight, without ceremony, without an aide, and without the public knowledge that he was carrying the question from one room to another. A private source would later confirm that the king entered the old library shortly after 1 in the morning and requested the transition archive. He found the incomplete scan. He also found a handwritten note attached to the original index card. The note was not signed. It stated that the missing page should be retrieved before any new interpretation of the family household was approved. Charles held the note between his fingers for a long time. The king had spent decades learning that silence could postpone a conflict but rarely resolve one. Yet he also knew that a direct refusal to Camilla could be seen as rejection not only of her grandchildren, but of the family he had worked to bring into public view. At dawn, he sent a message to William. Not a call, not a summons, a short request for a private meeting. The meeting took place in a small room used for reviewing historical papers. It had no cameras, no advisors, no defensible escape. The door was closed. The table held the incomplete scan, the request from Camilla's office, and a third page that had arrived from the archive before sunrise. William entered first. Charles stood beside the window. A few minutes later, Camilla arrived carrying no folder at all. The door opened before anyone could answer. She crossed the room and placed her hand on the back of the empty chair. She did not sit. "Is this a family meeting?" she asked. "Or an administrative hearing?" William remained standing. "It depends on whether the invitation is being treated as affection or entitlement." Camilla's expression tightened, but her voice stayed calm. "That is an unfair distinction." "No," William said. "It is the distinction." The king looked from one to the other. He had hoped to prevent this sentence from being spoken. Now that it had been spoken, he could not take it back. Camilla pointed toward the papers. "They are children." "They are," William replied. "They are part of my family." "They are." "Then why are we speaking as if their presence is a threat?" William did not answer immediately, because he knew the answer would hurt. "Because the institution cannot promise what it has never defined," he said. "And because a promise made for one family becomes an obligation for every family that follows." Camilla looked toward Charles. The king said nothing. That silence told her more than a speech might have done. She turned back to William. "You want them invisible." "No, I want the rules visible." It was the truth she had not expected to hear. William was not arguing that Camilla's grandchildren had no place in the family. He was arguing that the crown could not use them as symbols of unity at one event, and then pretend that the symbolism had no institutional consequences at the next. Camilla's confidence had come from somewhere. According to a private source familiar with the household discussions, an internal advisor had told her office that the king's desire for a united family made refusal politically impossible. The advisor believed William would not risk appearing hostile to children, and that the public would interpret any objection as a personal attack on Camilla. That advice gave the request courage. It also misunderstood William's restraint. He had no interest in public combat. He would not brief newspapers against Camilla. He would not allow friends to trade accusations on television. He would not turn a family disagreement into a daily contest of leaks. But refusing to fight in public did not mean surrendering in private. "The headlines are not the institution," he said. "If the decision is right, it must remain right when nobody applauds." Camilla stepped closer to the table. "You are the heir," she said, "not the king." The words landed with the weight of a boundary spoken aloud. William lowered his eyes to the papers. "Exactly." For the first time, Charles moved. He picked up the missing page. The page had been found in a separate archive envelope marked Household Transition Restricted. Restricted, meaning access limited to authorized personnel because the contents concerned sensitive institutional, personal, or constitutional matters, did not mean secret forever. It meant the paper was not to be interpreted casually or circulated without purpose. The page contained the definition the new request had omitted. "The immediate family of the consort," Charles read, "means those persons directly dependent upon or formally resident within the sovereign's household at the time of the event." Camilla's face changed. The clause had never described grandchildren generally. It described household dependence under a particular set of conditions. William looked at his father. "Read the next line." Charles read it. "Accommodation under this provision shall not establish a continuing right, standing invitation, or expectation of future inclusion." No one spoke. The room had become smaller, as if the words had removed every convenient exit. Camilla reached for the page, but Charles did not hand it to her. He placed it beside the original request and aligned the edges carefully. "The language was copied," she said. "Yes," Charles answered. "And someone knew the definition had been removed. We do not know that, but we know the definition was removed." "Yes," the king's voice was almost a whisper. "That is enough to stop the interpretation." William did not celebrate. This was not a victory anyone could display without appearing to celebrate exclusion. The decision protected the institution, but it also created a private wound that would not vanish simply because the paperwork was correct. Camilla looked at him. "You could have let the king decide." "I did. You forced the decision."
No!
That sentence ended the argument. The authority of the original document came from its place in the transition archive. A legacy instruction, meaning a written direction carried forward from an earlier administration because it governs continuity, cannot automatically override a new decision, but it can clarify the limits of a disputed practice. In this case, the instruction did not ban Camilla's grandchildren from family life. It prevented a temporary accommodation from becoming a permanent institutional right. Charles read the decisive clause again, this time for the witness who had entered quietly at the back of the room, the household secretary who had been asked to record the outcome. "No standing invitation," the king said. The secretary wrote the words down. Camilla looked at the pen. "Is that the official decision?" The king paused. "It is the decision required by the record." The formal refusal was entered into the event file. A formal refusal, meaning a written administrative decision that closes a specific request and prevents it from being treated as pending, does not carry the drama of a public announcement. It has no applause. It does not trend. Its power comes from being difficult to reinterpret later. The wording was careful. Camilla's grandchildren would not be prohibited from private family occasions. They would not be described as unwelcome. They would not be erased from the king's personal life, but they would not receive automatic access to royal events, merely because they belong to the family of the consort. The loophole closed permanently. Charles signed first. The household secretary signed second. William did not sign the refusal. As heir, he could insist on clarity, but he could not pretend to be the sole author of a decision made under the king's authority. His role was to protect the boundary, not to claim ownership of it. Camilla left the room without another word. The king remained beside the table. For several seconds, William stood across from him, watching the page dry beneath the ink. "Was this what you wanted?" Charles asked. "No. Then why did you press it?" William looked toward the window. "Because wanting a different answer does not make a different answer safe." The leak came 48 hours later. No one could say who sent the memorandum outside the palace. According to an archived record, only a small number of people had seen the complete file. Yet by the following morning, fragments of the copied clause were circulating among political correspondents and royal commentators. The first headline described the decision as a ban. The second called it a family rupture. The third asked whether William had humiliated Camilla to strengthen his future reign. The facts were more restrained than the headlines. There had been no public prohibition against private contact. There had been no removal of a title, no alteration of succession, and no accusation of misconduct. There had been a refusal to create a standing expectation at official royal events. But nuance rarely arrives first. Broadcasters replayed old images of Camilla with her grandchildren. They showed smiles outside churches, hands joined at charity occasions, and photographs from celebrations where the family appeared relaxed. Commentators debated whether the crown could claim to be modern while drawing a line around one branch of the family. Then an internal briefing was quoted on air. "The letter," the broadcaster said, "was never about children alone." The phrase became the day's central question. The public gathered outside the palace gates, not because anyone had been invited to witness the decision, but because the leak had turned a private document into a national argument. Some held newspapers, others held flowers. A small girl stood beside her mother with a handmade card that read, "Families need room." The crowd did not divide neatly. Some believed William had acted with necessary discipline. Others believed Camilla's grandchildren had been used as collateral in a succession struggle. Many simply watched the familiar pattern of power, a family disagreement entering an institution, and an institution returning it as paperwork. When the king's car passed the gates, the crowd became silent. No one knew whether he had approved the leak, resented it, or merely accepted that the document could no longer be kept private. His face appeared tired. His hands rested on the folder in his lap. The front page the next morning carried a sentence of 5 words or fewer. "Blood is not a charter." It was not an official royal statement. It was not a legal conclusion. It was the public's moral verdict, compressed into a line that carried both sympathy and warning. Camilla did not answer the coverage. William did not answer it either. The palace issued a narrow clarification, stating that private family relationships remained private and that attendance at official events was determined according to established household practice. Established household practice, meaning the repeated administrative method used to decide access, representation, and ceremonial participation, was not explained in detail. That omission was deliberate. If the palace explained every boundary, it would invite arguments over every exception. If it explained nothing, it would appear evasive. The statement therefore defended process without exposing the family's private exchange. Charles went quietly overnight again. This time, he did not visit the old library. He walked through the corridor where portraits of previous monarchs hung beneath dark wooden frames. The portraits did not show their family arguments. They showed only posture, clothing, and the confidence of people who had survived the moment long enough to be painted. The king stopped before a portrait of his mother. He had spent his life believing that a crown was a family inheritance. Now he understood it more painfully. A crown was a family inheritance only after the family surrendered the right to define it privately. A private source would later confirm that Charles asked for the event file to be sealed for future review. Sealed, meaning closed against routine access, retained as an official record, did not mean buried. It meant that the decision would remain available to those responsible for interpreting precedent in the next reign. That was the permanent consequence. Camilla's grandchildren were not cast out of the family. They were not denied affection. They were not made strangers to the king. But their attendance at royal events would be considered case by case, with no automatic claim created by earlier appearances. William's refusal became a boundary his own future household would have to obey. That was why it mattered. He had not simply rejected Camilla's request. He had accepted a rule that could later restrict people he loved. The moral high ground, if there was one, came at the price of giving up convenience. Camilla understood that price, even if she did not accept the decision. According to a logged memorandum, she later asked whether the king had been silent because he was afraid of her or afraid of the future. The answer was never recorded. Perhaps Charles had gone quiet because every available answer would injure someone. Perhaps he understood that a monarch's silence can become a message, and that the message is often read by the person already expecting rejection. The question remains less about whether Camilla's grandchildren deserve to be present than about who has the authority to decide what presence means. A family can gather because it wishes to gather. A crown gathers people because the gathering itself carries public meaning. The two worlds may overlap, but they are not identical. That difference is invisible in a photograph. It is unmistakable in a document. The letter remained in the archive, its seal broken, its language preserved, its missing page restored. One sentence had tried to turn accommodation into entitlement. Another sentence had stopped it. The palace gates opened the next week for an official ceremony. Camilla's grandchildren were absent from the formal procession. No announcement explained why. No usher drew attention to the empty space. The event proceeded with the polished calm expected of the crown. Yet in the crowd, the small girl with the handmade card returned. This time, she carried a flower. Her mother lifted her so she could see the royal car pass. The child waved, not at one person, but at the idea that families could remain connected even when institutions drew lines between them. William saw the crowd through the window. For 1 second, his expression softened. Then the car moved on. Inside the palace, the formal refusal remained active. It could not be quietly reversed by a birthday photograph or an emotional appeal. Any future exception would have to be recorded as an exception, not allowed to disguise itself as a right. The crown had chosen clarity over comfort. Charles had chosen silence until the record spoke. Camilla had forced the institution to confront the cost of treating a blended family as both ordinary and exceptional whenever convenience required it. William had learned that the heir's most powerful act is sometimes not a speech, but a refusal to let an uncertain practice become someone else's permanent burden. And the public learned that a royal ban, as the headlines called it, may not always be a ban on love. Sometimes it is a limit placed on the machinery surrounding love. The room where the decision began was empty by evening. The lamp had been switched off. The table had been cleared. The papers had been returned to the archive, where they would wait for the next person who believed a family request could change an institution without changing anything else. The door closed. The record remained. Charles, will they understand? William, they will when the rule protects them too. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.